Again, welcome everyone. We're going to get started now. For those that just joined, my name is Fatima, and I'm one of the presenters tonight. I wanted to share just a couple of important points before we get into the presentation itself. We are recording the session, so we'll be muting everyone but the presenters. If you could please remain muted, that'll help out with those who are currently participating and those who will watch the recording so that they can hear the content of the presentation. If you have any questions that come up for you at any point during this presentation, we'll take them through the chat. So you can just type them in there and I'll be keeping track. And if you can, please rename yourself on Zoom and include your preferred pronouns next to your name. We're also doing a survey. We just want to get to know who's on here, where you're located, and what's important to cover in the future, as well as what educational resources are needed related to this topic. So you can just click on that in the chat. Great. And I am a part of INI Institute. We're a small training institute. INI means reciprocity in Quechua, which is an indigenous language of communities in the Andes of South America. And as a training institute, we really see ourselves as one organization that's part of creating positive change in our country and around the world. We are focused on coaching, incubating, and supporting social movements and community organizations. And we also develop research and content on movements and movement dynamics. So that's just a little bit about us, about the INI Institute. The presenters, so there will be 3 presenters tonight. Carlos Saavedra is the founder of the INI Institute, and he's been a leader and community organizer in the immigrant rights movement since he was 16. He currently works to support social movements across the globe to create a better world. Our other presenter is Paul Engler, who's the director of the Center for the Working Poor in LA. He's movement director at INI and is a writer who co-authored This is an Uprising with Mark Engler. And again, I'm Fatima. I'm a trainer and facilitator at INI, and I get to work with US-based community organizations, but also have the blessing of working with indigenous leaders in Latin America. Before INI, I was a community organizer in California and was part of co-creating the Cosecha movement alongside Carlos and others. And we also have Rodrigo, who's not a presenter, but he is a movement educator and works to form alliances with indigenous communities in the global South. He's part of our INI team and he's helping us out tonight with our tech, so sending a lot of love. Yeah, that's a little bit about the 3 of us. 4.
Thank you, Fati. I don't know if people can hear me. My name is Carlos Saavedra. I'm excited to talk to all of you tonight. It's been I can say that maybe for all of us, that it's been a very intense ride, I think, to be home for the people that have been able to quarantine for a lot of days. So first of all, before we get started with, any of the content that we're trying to share tonight or today, I just want to send blessings to all of you individually, to your families, to your communities, because I know people are going through a lot in these times. And I just want to send a lot of love to everybody. Hope everyone can be safe as much as we can during this moment. So just wanted to say that. But what we're trying to actually do in this session over the next 90 minutes that we have with all of you is that we want to be able to present kind of an understanding of the moment that we're in and how that creates an opening for mutual aid. Actually, since the COVID-19 crisis or the corona pandemic has been going on, maybe in the last 2 to 3 weeks, at least very much publicly, and is much changing the world. There's actually been an array of mutual aid webinars that have surfaced and people have shared a lot of resources. Mutual aid is a very used technique and strategy that people in movements have been using for a long time. And there's actually a lot of great resources out there. And because we see ourselves as part of, all those little institutes or little educational and sharing materials, we are trying to actually do a webinar that doesn't focus on a lot of the technicalities of how you do a mutual aid and all the procedures within that. We're having a resource page that we're going to share at the end of this webinar for all the other resources that are there. It's really a lot of stuff to figure out around that. But based on what we've seen, we wanted to do a presentation that really talked a lot about the dynamics and possibilities of mutual aid, so we can truly, truly, really understand it, so that we can foresee problems that happen. So again, sending a lot of love to everybody who's been already doing a lot of PowerPoints and webinars around mutual aid, and we're trying to say some of the things that we don't think are being said, or repeat some of the things that we need to be repeated. So let's talk about the moment that we're in. So the first thing that we wanted to get all of us to understand is that we already lived in a very unsustainable system in the world. And I know that for the ones in this call that already are community organizers or activists or people that are a little conscious about the state of the world today, I know for many of us, we already know that. But actually, it's safe to say that for most of the world, people think, or not a lot, at least unless you're poor or you're really excluded from the system, you're really unaware of this crisis. So we are really seeing that the pandemic is increasing the already weak system that we have. It's already making it even more unreliable as the system that we have. And I know that a lot of us are every day. I don't know how many of you are reading articles early in the morning and late at night and throughout the whole day about how our healthcare system is just becoming overwhelmed, and it's going to get more and more overwhelmed as the infection rate increases. And of course, this all of us, none of us want to get infected. We want our families to be healthy. So this is creating a lot of panic and a lot of stress in a lot of us. And I know that a lot of us are also seeing that there's a humongous economic recession that is coming and that is already here in many ways that we're going to be having to deal with. So it is safe to say that, we're in a crisis moment. It's a difficult moment, but it's also safe to say that we've been in this crisis for a long, long, long time. And I say this before we even share about mutual aid and the strategy parts as well, is because I think it's important that we ground ourselves that actually the world's been in a very unsustainable place. Very, very unsustainable place. And it is even safe to say that not all of us even understand the degree of that unsustainability. And I think it's just been, the world is just really it's been going through a lot. And I know that many people in the world have felt this for a long time. We at INI work with a lot of indigenous communities. We also work, we're immigrants, and we work with a lot with undocumented community. We know that the system hasn't been working for a lot of people for a long, long time. So we know a lot of people have felt this before, and I know that the crisis is now a humongous more crisis because it's affecting the whole world. But I also know that a lot of people have been, I can tell you from, people that I'm close to, maybe friends and others that are, sometimes I feel like they say to me, Carlos, stop being, kind of a Debbie Downer, like the world's not that bad. And I'm always, oh, there's an emergency, the world, the Amazon was burning last year. I don't know if you relate to that, but I'm definitely that person with my friends and family members. And I feel like finally people are opening up and beginning to understand even a little bit how unsustainable the system has been, And one of the key things that we think is important in this moment of crisis, we kind of get a little unsettled because we have so much uncertainty and fear. And actually, we must really remember that there's all these great people that have already been working and have been already talking about all the repercussions of this. I work with indigenous communities that telling me for years that we should not be going into wildlife. We should protect the biosphere, our forests. And that's actually why we have this virus, because we don't respect the place where all these animals are living, and we're consuming them. And it's part of what's creating all this as well. And this moment, actually, I feel like it's multi-layer, and it's going to offer us a lot of moment of deep reflection, transformation, of change. It's going to be very painful because some of the hardest lessons we learn in our life are through big loss. And I know that a lot of people, we're going to lose a lot of people. A lot of us, we might be part of that loss as well in the world. We don't know with the uncertainties that we had. But we at INI believe there's actually a deep, deep reflection that I know that people are beginning to get little bit by little bit. But this is a whole process and a whole orientation. We do another training called Global Reciprocity in the long run, when we look at the last 5,000 to 10,000 years of history to understand this degree of unsustainability. And once we look at that, we're like, of course, these things tend to happen. We have a system that just wants to consume so much. Of course, the system is so weak on the social welfare, as long as it works for a few people in the world, then it's fine. So we know there's a deeper, deeper message. And we know that this moment actually requires us to be deeply, deeply rooted, deeply, deeply rooted. And that is why we're doing this workshop, because we actually believe that this is the time when we need to study more, we need to prepare more. It is safe to say that most of us that are either progressives or people on the left or people that are trying to help or support the world, that most of us are unprepared for this crisis, that we don't have a contingency plan, we didn't have the meeting about the pandemic. It is safe to say that, including us, you know, and the world is scrambling to figure out how to react. And maybe all of us are reacting, some of us are reacting 100%. We want to be able to challenge all of us to react a little less, maybe 50, maybe 40, maybe 30, so that we can have a more creative solution. Because in moments of crisis, there's of course threat, but also humongous amounts of opportunity for the things that we actually do need to get our world in a better place and mitigate the damage that we're going to go through. So just a little bit so that we get in the same page, just a little bit about the crisis. There will be books upon books written about all the dynamics, all the what was this crisis about, all that has happened in the world. And I want to turn it up to my brother, Paul Engler, to talk a little, give us a little perspective about this kinds of moments that happen. Paul, can you hear us?
Yes. Thank you, Carlos.
Right. I can hear you.
So when I was writing the book, This is an Uprising, and we were doing work with a training institute called Momentum, we were studying these dynamics of what we call trigger events, okay? And there's smaller trigger events, but then there's these really big trigger events, which are events that dramatically shake up everything: political, economic, social, cultural things. If you measure public opinion drastically changes. This is when parties rise and fall. This is when new demands become relevant, right? These things happen all throughout the globe on a national scale. They're all around. In Argentina, there was a collapse of their economy. There was a collapse of the economies in Eastern Europe with the Soviet collapse. And even in the United States, there was these huge trigger events that created a temporarily shift. And because people think that social change is incremental, but when you actually study trigger events, you realize that no, it's not actually true, that these huge moments, which are generally periods of anywhere from 3 months to about 3 years, are where there's huge shifts in where movements emerge and everything. And we see that with like when the Iraq War began and there was a huge response. We see that with the financial collapse in 2008. We see that with Hurricane Katrina. They each created a special opening, and orienting to that is very challenging for organizers. That's one of the things we realized, and one of the reasons why we did work with Momentum in creating curriculum is because we realized when we were community organizers and a trigger event happened, we realized that the common rules that we abide by in organizing no longer apply. There's a totally big vacuum or gap, and you need different tools. You need to orient in a different way during those moments because there's a different way of organizing. And then, if you go on the next slide, the coronavirus pandemic is by far the biggest trigger event of our generation, at least so far. It's so big, and it is creating all these dynamics at a scale that I've never experienced, and I've studied all these things within my lifetime, okay? It is huge. And what we have is we have an economic collapse. We have which is bigger than anything in 2008. We have an unemployment rate where people no longer are making as much money. Everyone's not working, or a huge portion of the economy is not working. The unemployment rates are anywhere from 15 to like 25, 30% of the population is unemployed, which is depression levels. Not until 1930s did we experience that level of unemployment. We have and we have that the market is, because of social distancing and pandemic, the market's not functioning in all these ways. It's hard to get materials. It's hard to get access to the market. And it's a healthcare crisis. Millions of people can die, and there's a possibility of that. That's horrifying. And there's so many things that is changing even in our culture overnight because we can't do the things that we could before just for mainstream institutions like schools to function. So that means that this is a big, big trigger event. And we have to study trigger events to understand what does that mean. And Naomi Klein studies trigger events, and she wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine that really is talking about how the elites, how capitalists and the elites and fascists use trigger events to move forward their agenda. And she's talking about one particular strategy that neoliberal conservatives use and have been using in the last 50 years to basically eliminate social services, get corporate bailouts, but basically destroy democracy as we know it. And they are, the opposition is thinking about how to function and what are the strategies in this moment. But there's another way of thinking about it, not just from the elite perspective. And there's this woman, Rebecca Solnit. She's a very famous writer and intellectual, an incredible person on many levels, wrote a book called Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster. And what she's talking about is in all these very concrete examples throughout the last 100 years, we have had this amazing dynamic of communities that form from the bottom up, a democratic and solidarity response that happens in the midst of disaster that people could have never expected. And really, it's a bubbling up of mutual aid, of social movement activity, and that activity can really revamp the culture. It can really create an opening for a lot of new positive things to happen, even in the midst of just horrendous disaster and death. She talks about the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1912, the Mexican earthquake of 1985, and Katrina in New Orleans in the last 20 years. Go on. And one of the things we see is that in those liminal space, and I've realized this from studying social movements, is that if you're prepared for trigger events, you can create social movements very quickly that can expand, because all of a sudden, everyone's activated and agitated in a new way, and their new organizations have to form to basically engage all these people in mass participation. And we saw that in a movement that politically in the inside game was the New Deal, but it was all these social movements emerged out of the Great Depression, out of this crisis. But it took a few years of transitioning from Hoover to FDR, and that was an amazing, one of the perfect examples of the extraordinary communities and movements that arise from these trigger events. Do you want to say anything more there, Carlos?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I just would like to add is that definitely this is a humongous trigger event. I think, I experience things in the immigrant rights movement with the 2006 immigrant rights marches. I experienced raids that had happened where they took, for example, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, they took 361 people, and in Iowa, Postville, immigration took almost 800. So I experienced some of those in smaller things, but I haven't experienced something as globally connected. And I think the important thing for us, I think, to internalize in this moment is that we have to really see that there's been similar moments in our collective history that we can pull some wisdom from, and that those moments create humongous threats for us that we need to figure out how to work around, and also opportunities for us to protect ourselves and even do some things. And one of the things that I wanted to add also to this thing is that the situation that we do face is very critical. We do face, there's many different estimates that a lot of different scientists are doing around that kind of impact on lives that this is going to have, but we are going to lose a lot of people in the world. I think I have family members in Madrid and Spain that, are in a very difficult situation over there, so I think we're going to face a lot. And I think we have to really be able to pause for a second in whatever efforts that we're doing and whatever ways that we're acting or reacting in this moment, And we have to really think about what were similarities for other moments and what were some of the other organizing strategies and ways and examples that we can learn from. And maybe to lead to this next part is that part of what we're trying to also is that, by the way, studying and seeing all these different moments, and Paul recommended some great books and some things to read as well. There's a lot of things that happens on this moment. And we just wanted to make it simpler, categorize that we think there's two major responses that happens on these moments. On one side, we see that there's actually a lot of advocacy, meaning that people are demanding through many ways of political pressure, are demanding the government or the state and companies or within the market to meet the needs that people have on this moment. Usually in this moment, there's a lot of that happening, which is important. And there's a lot of people that are doing that in local community organizations. There's politicians doing that. There's people doing it in their jobs by themselves. There's a lot of people that are advocating to have their needs met in this moment. And then there's mutual aid, which is people coming together as a community to meet their needs collectively. And these are really two different strategies or two different responses that people are actually using. And it's important to, for the sake of creating more clarity, think about them a little bit as separate. And let me talk first about advocacy, and then we're just gonna go right into mutual aid. So the interesting thing around the advocacy is that during a trigger event, things that were previously unimaginable quickly actually become reality, because the political map is so being remade that things that maybe seemed impossible before seem possible in a particular time. So I know that many of you, if you've been part of the left or in progressive movements for a long time, you have heard of universal basic income. I knew Andrew Yang, that ran for as a Democratic nominee for president, was talking a lot about it, did his whole platform around giving people $1,000 a month for universal basic income because of the threat of automation and how to keep capitalism going and so forth and so on. But people on the left have been talking about universal basic income for a long time. But think about just 2 months ago when we were saying we were in normal times where we've been fighting in the left, whether Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who was going to win. I still remember those good old days when that was, the fights that we were going was about that, And Andrew Yang, what he was saying seemed radical, seemed difficult even to believe. People say, how are you going to pay for all that? How are you going to give people $1,000 a month? How is this going to happen? How is that? A lot of unanswered question because it's a radical proposal. Then as soon as the corona pandemic became more intense, we saw people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually demanding some of this, which I know she's been talking about this for some time, but actually being heard about this issue, the issue becoming more popular. And you can really see things changing when Mitt Romney comes out about it. Republican governor of my state of Massachusetts, now a Republican senator that ran for president. And you can see this thing happen. And it's like, what is happening? The thing that seemed possible, it's changing dramatically. This is kind of what this moment's produced, Now we're seeing, I know there's been, we've been preparing this presentation today, so I don't know if the Senate bill just passed today. It passed today, right? I haven't read all the details, but I know it includes some sort of provision of giving people some financial resources to be able to withstand that crisis. So it's just an example of how the advocacy moves. And we know that this is just the beginning, and we know that people are doing advocacy on a lot of fronts. For example, I think it was yesterday, maybe it was 2 days ago. I don't know how all of you are even organizing the days. For me, it could be yesterday or 2 weeks ago. I don't remember. Times is going really fast. But I know that sanitation workers were doing a kind of a very quick work stoppage. And we know that's happening in a lot of areas, in a lot of different industry, because they feel unprotected. So we know that on the advocacy front, there's a lot of demands that are going to be emerging and a lot of political activity that is going to be happening as this gets more intense. We know that the nurses are going to be thinking about doing something else. There's going to be a lot of different advocacy political responses. Paul, I don't know if you want to add anything to this part.
Well, I just want to say that already Canada, I think, is doing a universal basic income of $2,000 until the pandemic's over. In Nordic countries, they're already doing 80% of unemployment benefits with 80% of your income, which is a totally different reconceptualization of unemployment insurance. And we're seeing also that there's all these really huge responses, coalitions forming all over from the top all the way down of people that are responding, whether it's Bernie Sanders, Warren, the nurses, coalition of national community organizers that are putting out different national demands about what to do that are gaining steam in a very fast way because they are stepping into the trigger event.
So I just want to put a little pin to this because we just want to recognize that there's a lot of advocacy, a lot of political pressure that is happening, that will continue to happen, and we need to do more of it. Next week, we have our second webinar next week. Really is going to try to talk more about this. So I just want to say that because we want to focus more on mutual aid, but there's a whole thing that we have to figure out about how to do the advocacy better and how to unite it with the mutual aid. We'll talk about that hopefully next week as well. But Paul, how about you tell us just a little bit about the gap that is creating now for mutual aid?
So when we have trigger events that create a huge gap in the market and the government response in a disaster, there is something, not just is there a potential for social movements that do advocacy to grow, but there's also an incredible opening that emerges for mutual aid. Sometimes that formulates into the movement. Sometimes there's just a lot of bubbling up. And a lot of what we are really going to be focusing on is a few different examples of that. The biggest one being the AIDS crisis in the 80s, right? Where there was another disaster, specifically in certain communities, and there was a response. But what we wanted, if you go to the next slide, what we really wanted, if we go to the next slide, what we really want to talk about is these happen with specific types of trigger events when the state and market can't or won't respond to a tremendous need. And a lot of times it's an urgent need. Like in the case of the AIDS crisis, it was people were literally dying in the thousands and tens of thousands of people were dying, and there wasn't the response. So what is the way that the gap is filled is by these emergent mutual aid networks that can expand drastically, very quickly. And we see that in the AIDS crisis. The AIDS crisis started in 1980, and it grew and grew and grew, but the government just totally turned a blind eye to it, a lot because of homophobia and classism and racism. The three major populations that were first hit with the AIDS epidemic were gay men, primarily Haitians, and hemophiliacs, and the very vulnerable and marginalized communities in a lot of ways. And Reagan even refused to mention that the disease existed in a public address for like multiple years. The amount of money the government put in to trying to prepare for this pandemic that now has killed worldwide like over 30 million people. I mean, in the United States, 700,000 people have died now of AIDS. But in the early days, it was in a lot of LGBT communities, it's talked about as like a genocide within their community, and there wasn't a response. Actually, they even had a hard time getting state benefits like unemployment and disability because it wasn't even recognized as a disease in the early days. So what happened is the community started bonding together. One of the examples that everyone uses, the gay men's health crisis in New York, created a system of providing many types of mutual aid, of getting a database of people who needed things, creating proto-family types. They had this thing called the buddy system where they tried to get people formed into family groups that could take care of each other. They had a hotline where they called people and phone banked people about critical information about the disease. They coordinated, and then it took them about 7 years of developing this huge mutual aid network all across the country that then formulated more and more into a movement. The AIDS health crisis movement, and later on ACT UP became a lot of the logo and brand of the movement, and that became an advocacy wing of the movement. And they did tremendous things to then use mutual aid to actually advocate not just for benefits for their members or patients or people, but actually to a whole very sophisticated critique of how the healthcare system needed to respond to the pandemic, that now everyone looking back, even people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, I think that's how you say his name, acknowledge that the ACT UP and this movement changed the way we respond to pandemics, and really was the leader of getting the establishment, the government, and the market to start responding. Even pharmaceuticals, they did tremendous things. They did some of the most dynamic direct action. If you study a nonviolent direct action like I do, you will study ACT UP, because they did hundreds of the most creative things you could have imagined, shutting down bridges, taking over the stock exchange, and throwing fake blood around, doing the AIDS quilt. Well, that was another organization, but the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which became this huge memorial. All these things, incredibly creative direct action that dramatized around the motto, silence equals death, and turned the issue into something that was a stigma and shame around having AIDS, and to 10, 20 years later, it became a very popular issue that even right and left would put resources in, maybe not enough, but became very popular to respond to the AIDS crisis in the foundation world. Another example that I think we can learn a lot from is Hurricane Sandy. The Hurricane Sandy disaster that came into New York in the 2000s, and then the response to it, which was Occupy Sandy. What happened is Occupy Wall Street as a movement exploded, and it created occupations that knew how to do collective participation and involve thousands of people in affinity groups and in general assemblies. And Occupy Wall Street started contracting and the movement started falling apart. But then when this hurricane came into New York, a lot of the same networks that knew how to get tens of thousands of people participating and knew the technology, the social media technology, the organizational technologies, were able to pivot and create an immediate response that now is being studied because it ran circles around the Red Cross and and FEMA initially in the very early days, because it was able to get all these people that wanted to respond to such a disaster that destroyed all these neighborhoods into affinity groups, into general assemblies, into doing hotlines, getting people out doing cleanup, to doing mass food distribution, to getting millions of people funneling resources into very specific things using mass email technology and gathering donations. All things that they had learned from an advocacy movement, they transitioned into a mutual aid movement. And there's a lot to be said about that. Their Inter-Occupy, which is the organization that formed Occupy Sandy, is coordinating network calls, getting mutual aid networks to coordinate. There's other organizations that are trying to explain the amazing lessons from Occupy Sandy. There's a report that Homeland Security sanctioned a report talking about how that Occupy Sandy created a mutual aid response that is amazing, that in some ways could not be provided by Red Cross or FEMA, because it was responding in a way that movements respond to a trigger event.
Thank you, Paul. And one example that I wanted to share was that about great response, because I think there's other great lessons in that as well. As I was sharing with you in the town and city of New Bedford in 2007, there was an immigration rate of 361 people in 2007. That's been a while ago now. And I was one of the organizers that was sent there to respond and to get people, give people support. Just to give you a sense, 600 immigration agents came in, descended from all over the country to arrest 361 people. It was in a factory where people used to make the vest for the military, right? And there were all the workers, most of them were undocumented. And there were, when I got there at 10 a.m., the rate had been at 8 a.m. There were helicopters all over the place. And it was a real crisis for that community, because we had young children that didn't have their mothers. We didn't have, whole parents were disappeared essentially from their families. We actually didn't know where to find people, because the company, they wouldn't pay you overtime. So the company will send you to get another name so that you can work the other 8 hours in a different name. So that based on in what shift they capture you, we didn't know who you were or what jail you were in or what at what detention center you were in. So we were there putting the response together. We had to set up, you know, a database, get everyone on board. There was very little Facebook back on those days, and at least for a lot of the people in the community. So we had to use a church as a platform. Within the first seven days, we raised almost $120,000, and we were able to cover for a while people's rents, people's food for a long time. There was even advocacy to sue the employer, and those workers, some of those workers won 1 or 2 years later. So it's a different context, but the reason why we're sharing some of these examples is because there's other ways that people in very difficult situations, maybe not as difficult as the one we're facing today, as a globe maybe, are facing, but there's some lessons that we can learn there that we can figure out. There's a little bit of the pictures of the response in a church that we were in. There will be 500 families there every night. But some of the summary that we want to do to kind of put a middle point in this presentation, in the next part, we're going to talk about the mutual aid dynamics, is that number one is that mutual aid can be used by people and movements to really feel the vacuum of this moment. I think that's one big thing that we're trying to say. I think the second thing we're also saying is that we really must learn it as a strategy. There's been a lot of other groups in the past that done some great things, that we can have some best practice of the past, including people around the world, outside of the US, outside of Europe, like in our countries, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Africa. There's been a lot of people that we've been excluded from the economy. They've already been in a crisis, that there's a lot to be learned. Homeless communities across the country, you know, that are living to survive. And really, mutual aid is a strategy to survive, you know. And I can tell you, when I was undocumented many years ago, and seeing a lot of my peers in the drink movement, or young people, we couldn't go to school. We couldn't do a lot of things. We wanted to protect ourselves from detention. We had to form a whole network of us to figure out how we can protect each other so that we can protect our families. I mean, a whole way of doing that. And that's a whole strategy that we need to learn and think about. The third thing that we want to say is that we know that a lot of organizations that maybe, if you're an organization that already does mutual aid, rock and roll. But if you're in an organization that doesn't do mutual aid, or it's new to it, a lot of people think that this is just a thing of 2 to 3 or 4 weeks. I'm gonna do something for now temporarily. And what we're saying is like, this is mutual aid is what we're going to be doing for a long time, at least a year or 2 years, because of the economic crisis, of the impact. People are going to have to figure out how to pull their resources to protect each other and survive in the ways that we have to do. So it's something that we cannot just, it's something we have to put resources to it within an organization to make it happen. And the last thing that I want to say, and that's why we gave you some different examples from the AIDS crisis to the immigration rates to kind of the Hurricane Sandy, is that each context is different. And by that, we mean each neighborhood is different. Each population is different. So we actually don't think there's like a model that tells you all exact things. I think there's a lot of best practices, but I think each context is different in how to do mutual aid. And it has to fit. People need to be kind of creative to figure out how to meet those needs. I don't know, Paul, if you want to add anything last before we do a little Q&A.
No, I think this is good. The only thing I just want to say is I've always been shocked at how much I have to change to do things during trigger events. And unions that I've worked with in the past, community organizations, they know how to do things to get things done or even provide services. But that way of doing things doesn't apply to a trigger event. We have to reorient. And what we're saying is there is a way of thinking about social movements that will naturally emerge from trigger events, that can emerge if we believe in it and understand the strategies. And that there's one that's a movement of advocacy and there's a movement of mutual aid. But if you don't understand the strategy and believe in the possibilities of it within this trigger event, and understand that there's tremendous possibilities for this to grow. I mean, there's millions of people right now that are at their house that don't have work. And so that can create an incredible opening. And there's a need that we need to even just survive so that millions of people don't die.
Sorry. Thank you, Paul and Carlos, for everything you've shared so far. I'm keeping track of the questions. I've seen some on the chat to everyone, but also some directly to me. I have seen a couple that I feel or I'm hoping will be answered in the second portion, or they would fit best there. So I'm going to go with a question that was answered by a couple of different people. that goes, how do you get buy-in from people to mutual aid in a system that promotes such rugged individualism? Said in another way, what messaging do we use to pull new people into mutual aid?
That's a good question. I mean, what I would say is that people, we need to be able to tell a narrative and story what's actually happening on the ground. I think that's one big thing that needs to happen. I think there's a lot of acts of reciprocity that are happening that are amazing. I know that we want to also focus on all the acts of individualism that we actually see a lot, and actually is where people probably get the most upset about it, like hoarding and other things. But I think it's important, one, that we tell the stories of actually how we're doing mutual aid every day, like the good stories, the stories that are positive about people coming together. I think the second thing that I would say is that people have to experience it. And I think there's a lot of people that have needs that they are unable at this moment to, one, because there's some sort of, individualism has allowed us to kind of shut down our needs and be prideful about it so that we can be self-sufficient. But actually, if people reach out and call each other and say, hey, what do you need? Or, hey, there's so much in the reaching out and people building relationships that can actually melt that, But I think it's going to have to go through the experience of people joining mutual aid or being in mutual aid with one another to begin to do some of that melting. But that's just some thoughts. I'm sure there's a lot of others. I don't know if Pio or Fatima, you have other thoughts about that question.
Yeah, I would just add, I think earlier you were all talking about just the needs that arise during trigger events, and also the needs that arise because the needs aren't being met by the government or by companies, the state, or the market. I also feel like until the need is great enough for people to feel like I need something and I can't reach those needs by myself, people may not actually need to reach out or respond to any initiative that others are taking. So I feel like to get to even more people or to massive amounts of people, there is a piece that's related to just the needs growing to such a scale or growing to such an amount that people are kind of forced to act differently.
Thank you, Fatih. Okay, maybe we can continue. Oh,
yeah.
I am in an echo. So let's go into part 2, because I think we might be able to talk about some of the other questions that are happening here. Also to resonate with what Fatima's saying, and we were talking with Rodrigo, Fatima, and I a couple of days ago that we haven't hit yet the moment where a lot of more needs are going to be press people to reach out to one another. So it depends on each context. But if some people have enough food and some people still have one more month of rent, then people can hold up. They can rest, maybe they can reach out in some needs, but actually what's the need that is going to get you to knock on your neighbor's door? So there will be the moment, and there's a preparation for the moment that we might have to. The first thing that we want to talk on, what we're going to talk in this next part 2, is we're going to talk about the difference between mutual aid and services. We're going to talk about 3 different distinctions in mutual aid that I think are important that we mention. These are in some ways the basics, the foundational basics. And on mutual aid and services, what we want to say is that mutual aid is not services, even though you could have services within mutual aid. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So in these times of need, because our social fabric, particularly in the US, is so weak, okay? If in most people, the social fabric in my country is very different. I'm from Peru. Our social fabric is different. There's less shame about reaching out to each other for certain things. But in this country, there's a lot of isolation. So what happens in these moments is that when moments like this happen, a lot of people become service needers. Like, I need a service. It's like, oh, I don't have an employment, so who can help me with unemployment? I don't have this food, who can give me food? And a lot of organizations sometimes that do services or don't do services become service providers. Get on a call with people and they say, hey, I am here and we're gonna provide for you. But actually most organizations don't even have the resources for the needs that people have, right? So the difference between mutual aid and services is that mutual aid actually says that both parties, person A and person B, both can give and receive. Okay, this is really important. They both can give and they both need to receive. And it's a different orientation because everybody can be a service provider and everybody can be a service recipient. And that's what creates the mutuality of that. So let me give you some examples. And Paul, you can help me with this too, with AA as well in a second. So again, just want to clarify, we're not saying services are bad. Services are very important. They're very, very needed. And we know right now, actually, a lot of people within the mutual networks are getting services that they really need to survive. So I just want to say that is so important, okay? But also, in the way that we sometimes, for example, look at AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the recovery work that they do, okay? In some ways, you have one way of doing it, which is like, hey, if you have the means to access therapy by even paying into a therapist, or if you have the economic resources to do that, or if the state subsidizes you to have therapy, then you can access a professional, somebody who's licensed, somebody who can support you, or even a counselor that can support you to go through your recovery process. That's a way of doing a service, right? It's expected that the counselor or the therapist is the one giving you the therapy, supporting you, and you're the one receiving it or going through your process. But it's never the other way around, right? There's not an expectation that then you're gonna give me some therapy after this so that I can become better, right? It's very clear the boundaries of the relationship. But for example, in AA, in the recovery movement, it's a different perspective, because the whole circle of the people that sit around and do the sharing are going to the 12 steps. They're all in each other being counseled by the group, counsel with one another, and they're also counseling each other and they're supporting each other. So it's a different orientation where everyone is a therapist and a therapy. I don't know if that's the right language, but within the context. I don't know, Paul, if you want to add more on the AA.
Well, I just want to say 12-step, when it started, Bill W., even before the Great Depression, realized that there wasn't a space, there was a total vacuum to deal with what he called bottom feeder drunks, people who had chronic addiction problems and that would go to hospitals to detox, but there wasn't a place for them to get all the services they need. So he studied social movements, and he realized that for his own recovery, the only way he could do it was he had to rely on other people who were going through recovery to provide him support. And he wrote into the steps of recovery, the last step, the 12 steps, is to actually give back and to give to the people and to the community and the fellowship that which you have received is part of your own recovery, okay? And this makes 12-step very unique in that it expands. There's millions of hours of free therapy that's done in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not funded by the government. People give just a little bit of money just to be able to support a space to meet in, but it actually grows during depression and recessions. 12-step grows. It doesn't shrink because it's not dependent on the market or the government. And a lot of, we're not saying the professional infrastructure and stuff is not valuable, but a lot of the services that are needed and all the time to be around people to get the encouragement and the support happens in mutual aid networks. And this model of mutual aid has expanded to many different 12-step programs from families, dysfunctional families, to Overeaters Anonymous, to Codependents Anonymous, to Al-Anon, to now this model has grown. Now there's millions of people in different 12-step programs. There's over 1 million in the United States and millions across the globe in this thing. And the reason it was able to expand is because in its basic foundation is the concept and theory of mutual aid. Another example that I think is very interesting is I worked for a long time with Unite Here hotel and restaurant workers in Local 11 in Los Angeles and with the International. And one thing that I learned is that unions, a lot of times, some unions have what we call service unionism, in which union reps provide services to their members, and they're almost like little lawyers. They go around and they enforce a contract, and they provide services to their members. If they get laid off, they might even deliver food to them. But it's really about the worker pays dues to be a member, and then the professionalized class of organizers give services, right? And that is a lot of what unionism is talked about. And people experience when they experience a union. But there is a movement model of unionism that's really seen deeply when people go on strike. Because when people go on strike, there's no longer dues. Now everyone all of the members are now out on strike, and they get a little bit of a stipend from the union just to survive, and they're not paying dues. And at that moment, everyone collectively is in this struggle together, and thousands of members now are working collectively to create picket lines, to provide food for each other, to do lots of different types of mutual aid. And throughout the history of strikes, some of the most vibrant examples that we see of great mutual aid happens during these strikes. But it's very hard for union leadership to reorient from servicing to a strike mentality where we want to create mass participation in mutual aid, advocacy and mutual aid, but specifically we're talking about mutual aid, so that people can take care of each other. When there's thousands of people on strike, they can do things to take care of each other that you can't scale up with just a professionalized staff.
Thank you, Paul. And one more to finish this part about the mutual aid and services, and the distinction of this too, is that to do mutual aid, and I think from the question that folks were asking in the call, how do we break these boundaries of individualism, of isolation that we have in community? They say that desperation is the mother of invention or creativity. And I really think that the needs are so important, and really actually building the network, building the trusting relationship so that we can exchange with one another is so important, because it's so different from sometimes services. Not that people in services cannot develop the relationships, they do. But sometimes people don't orient about building deeper relationships as part of keeping the service going. Like it's like a one-time transaction and goodbye, but actually to meet our needs, to be able to tell each other our needs. Like, hey, look, I need help for the rent. There's so much shame about that. Or I need help with food. Or, you know what, we need to protect ourselves from immigration. There's a lot of vulnerability there that goes in which is a different orientation that just being service providers or service recipients, but actually forming a mutual aid network. Okay, so that's one distinction. Second distinction we want to talk about is mutual aid as a people's insurance policy. And this is really, really important, because this, in some ways, what we're trying to share right now is what makes a mutual aid network resilient and what makes it important in some ways. One of the things is that we got to really understand, for the people on this call that are already activists, or people that are already in some ways engaged in organizing or in social change for either recently or a while, we're already oriented. We know the organizations. We know kind of the words that we use. We kind of know who to go to support to. We can develop mutual aid networks for ourselves very quickly because we know each other. We already know the lingo. We know that we have to be collective, right? But for most of the population, people don't really know that they can depend on the community for some of those needs. Sometimes they only think they can depend on their family, on their close people, but not everyone else, right? So the mutual aid effort needs to be able to be seen as reliable from people, that it can meet needs. And this is what allows the network, the mutual network, to actually grow and expand, right? So in some ways, we need to really see people investing in the system so the system can meet more and more and more needs. And that's where the network starts creating. When I was in United We Dream, when I was in the Dream movement for so many years ago, like people, we all believe if you're in the movement's going to protect you. If there's a deportation, we all going to run your campaign. We're all going to raise money for you. That was a commitment that people made to each other. And the more people that you have, the more that you can do that. The more that you can do that, the more the system gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And maybe Paul, explain or share, because I think you got better in this metaphor. Tell more the metaphor about the people's insurance policy.
Well, for insurance to work, you have to have credibility that you're paying into it, but that it's reliable when you need it, that it's going to be there. And what's really interesting about mutual aid networks is that you need a critical mass you need both the relationship so that people know that's there for them, that's going to be there, but you have to keep it going, that there's an exchange, and you have to hit a critical mass. And unlike with 12-step, the bigger the network gets, the more the pooled resources and the more reliable it is. And so when networks and mutual aid become big enough, it becomes reliable that we know it's going to be there when we need it the most. And that happens when we get a critical mass. And the more people we add to it, the stronger it gets, which is a different orientation than servicing, which is the more people are relying on it, the weaker the system is overwhelmed. So what I'm talking about in insurance policy is it has to be a thing where it becomes reliable enough so that we can rely on it, and we're constantly giving to it to know that it can give back in our time of need, creates something deeply psychological for us. And that changes the nature of mutual aid as a strategy when people get that where. But they have to start building the relationship to get to that place where really the network starts flourishing and getting to a critical mass.
So one thing just to add in this last part is that we're saying to gain credibility, mutual aid networks need to reach a critical mass. This is really, really important. And really, I'm really orienting to the whole country, at least for us that are in the United States. I know people are in other countries too, and they have their own jurisdictions, their own places. You have to figure out how regular people that are most going through this crisis, which is a lot of people, most people in the world, how can we gain critical mass? And we think there's a whole set of things that are preventing, Paul and I and others worked in a training institute called Momentum that is still running and has tons of great materials that people should use. We're putting it on the resource page. But there's two challenges that we think are important that we name in creating critical mass that I think is for the people that are already in network. So if you're not in a network, well, you should think about it. And if you're already on a network, these are probably challenges that we're all going to face. I think the first one is that to create critical mass, we need to have a shared identity or a shared story, meaning that people need to be able to identify the mutual aid network as a joint effort. They need to see that what's happening in Boston is the same thing that is happening in New York, the same thing that is happening in Miami. That creates more credibility, even if it's within your neighborhoods. You know, sometimes the credibility can happen because that identity could happen because there's a shared story, there's a shared name, there are shared colors, there's a shared branding. This is some of the branding from ACT UP and the Dream Movement, you know, the cap and gown from the Dream Movement, the branding, the logo, the story that ACT UP that was able to unify all these mutual aid networks, you know. So that's one of the major challenges that we see, because there could be a lot of networks that are doing great stuff, but really what creates critical mass is the unification of them. Not that they lose their own context or their own autonomy. No, but that they can share with one another, respect their autonomy, but gain more resources. Yeah, right. So for example, if you have friends in other areas that are not in the movement and connected, can they recognize that there is a mutual aid network in their area? You know, do they know where to go in? Is it in a language that they can understand? Do they understand that they need to invest in the network? Do they understand the people's insurance policy thinking? We need to create that for ourselves too, to be safe. Clearly, we cannot depend on the government for that. And the second challenge to having critical mass is a shared resource and infrastructure. There's a lot of things that could happen, but just to give you another example is that we have families in different parts of the country, or some of us in the world. There's not a website that we have right now that a lot of people can reach out. And even if there is one right now, we need to be able to promote it. We need to be able to take care of it, you know, so that people can find the needs, that they can find the needs and post the resources that they have on those pages, right? So we see those two as two key challenges to creating critical mass that I think we're going to have to figure out how to orient our networks to. Great. And let's talk about the last one, Paul.
Well, one of the things that is also really important to getting to that critical mass, other than just shared identity and shared resources, a meta organization and a meta identity that allows a real movement. And you can look at Momentum. We talk a lot about what is that? What's the meta movement infrastructure that all the little separate different things need to have an umbrella to be able to get a critical mass. But another thing we realize is if you look at the history of social movements, whether it's the civil rights movement with the Black church, the early advocacy in the early civil rights movement was really led by mutual aid networks within the Black church. If you look at the Montgomery bus boycott, which was the first major trigger event within the civil rights movement, there's a lot of study by Alan Morris that almost all the resources didn't come from grants or from solidarity from different populations all across the country. It really emanated from mutual aid within the Black church. And they formed, even the form of resistance, the boycott that they did, was really run as a parallel alternative mutual aid car ride system. Okay, and the reason they were able to do that is because they knew how to build mutual aid, because it was a community, a Black community, that because of Jim Crow and segregation was eliminated from the mainstream institutions, okay? But the movement needs the mutual aid to help it become a movement in the early stages, and the mutual aid networks needs the advocacy movement. They work in tandem, what we call there is a healthy movement ecology. And we take for granted in the United States of America that some of the biggest organizations, AARP, NAMI, Sierra Club, ACT UP, these are all major advocacy organizations that are very powerful within different issue groups that really came out of mutual aid networks, okay? And it made both the mutual aid stronger because it recruited more people and publicized the mutual aid with the greater population because they were doing advocacy, like the Sierra Club, which was originally started as nature appreciation groups, hiking groups, mutual aid groups that now have some of the biggest base of people with donations that are activated that now advocate for environmental issues. NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, has the largest network of mutual aid support for families with chronically mentally ill family members. And that mutual aid network is the biggest base for advocacy. And ACT UP, like we were talking about before, TAG, the treatment action group of ACT UP, became such an influential reform group within the National Institute of Health and the FDA in changing the whole way in which medicine is done and testing and how accountable it is to patients and to people that are suffering with illness.
Thank
you. You want to take it, Carlos?
I can do it. Thank you, brother. So there's some challenges in mutual aid that we're going to wrap up the dynamics of mutual aid, and then we're going to offer 3 little basic concepts for the people that want to get started or want to strengthen their networks. Again, as I said, there's a lot more technicality to talk about that. We're trying to root ourselves into the deep strategy because this is going to be long-term. Does that make sense? And there's going to be a lot of problems that arise in doing that. But we want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of mutual aid. Number one is that sometimes mutual aid can be insular and inaccessible. Right? Sometimes we're in just one neighborhood or one particular types of people, and we can become insular and inaccessible in a way that we're only not extending to other people that need needs. You know, we're not reaching out and growing to other people that need needs, right? Why? Because also sometimes we feel like if we grow the network, we won't be able to meet people's needs. Right? So there's a sense of also trust that we have to figure out. It's a constant, it's a difficult process, right? The second thing is that sometimes you can have a hard time engaging with politics because it can polarize members. So maybe get them shift from just mutual aid to doing advocacy and political pressure might be difficult because actually when you're doing mutual aid, there is not a lot of agreement and alignment on what kind of politics you want to have, right? You're just agreeing that you need mutual aid. You're agreeing that you're neighbors. But once you start taking positions or start pushing people or how aggressive you even want to be, there's tensions, right? So those are just tensions and challenges of mutual aid. 3, I think it's sometimes, which is I think part of 1 is that sometimes it can create such a difference from other people that it can sometimes isolate themselves from regular people that are still, you know, don't have the right words, don't have the right, or don't have the culture that the movements are proposing yet, you know. I think a lot of people are just living in the dominant system, you know, caught up with what the media is selling and feeding to a lot of people. So sometimes mutual aids can become exclusive in that way, even the ones that are really trying to help out, you know. And the last one is that it's really hard to sustain after the gap has been filled. And actually, Paul, can you talk about that one?
Yes. So like Occupy Sandy, for instance, when the government is able to fill in, when the services are there and available, they have resources that mutual aid doesn't have. They have professionals. When the medical establishment can come in and provide healthcare a lot there and do that in a way and communicate with the public that it can't do during a pandemic or a disaster a lot of times because the systems are overwhelmed. It's very hard for mutual aid to compete and a lot of times isn't designed. Mutual aid, all the things we do in this trigger event to create mutual aid that can scale, that can expand, that can become a movement, all the things that we do to orient to this trigger event in this liminal space actually don't necessarily make sense when the gap is filled, when the disaster has passed, because then other institutions can fill that in. So in some ways, one of the challenging things is how do we how do we create these structures that can fill the gap, but also how do we transition them into long-term sustainability is a really important thing, because we need those long-term stability of mutual aid and advocacy in our movements, and we need them in a movement ecology to create the change that we want, and to hold people even through the disaster and through recovering from disaster. And that's really hard to do with the mutual aid networks that are responding to this trigger event.
Thank you, Paul. And we have one last part about some basic concepts, and then we're just going to share a little bit about them, and then we're going to give it to Fatima so that we can start closing and go into questions and answers. We're going to stay here past the 9 for the people that want to stay and do more questions and answers. We can talk a little more, but we can also let go for the people that have other commitments at 9. So some of the basic concepts that we want to share, and again, there's a resource document we're going to talk about, is number 1 is that mutual aid is not a service, and that we need to figure out how do we talk to ourselves about that, and how to make mutual aid be able to scale up to meet our needs. We have to create the trust. We have to tell the stories. We have to be talking to people. You know, I've been talking the last few days, I don't know how long it's been since we've been in quarantine at this point, about people setting up these networks. And the biggest thing is that we have internalized so much that about services, you know, that we have to serve other people, and that people are there and we have resources, we got to give it to them. But that is important. We got to do that. There's a lot of that has to happen. But actually, this is a moment for an invitation with our neighbors and with the people close to us to actually talk and be like, hey, what do you really need? What is going on? I want to be here for you, you know? And I think there is that relationship that we need to build. We need to tell stories. You know, I know there was, I think it was what is it called? Some people that were sharing some of the great narratives that are happening with mutual aid, sharing good stories. We need more of that. So that's the first basic concept. We hope it could be telling stories. It could be telling one-on-ones. It could be telling text messages. We got to really get that there. The second thing that we think is a basic concept, foundational, is we got to set up a way to communicate and share between peoples and families, right? And everyone has different peoples that we're relating to. So if you are trying to start a group, start a WhatsApp group, start a Facebook group. Some people, for example, in me with the immigrant community, people are not used to a lot of these groups, you know, but for example, Slack, that nobody knows Slack, you know, I barely figure out how to do Slack, you know, so we got to really figure out how to set up the communication platform. And for example, in my blog here, if we are not able to synchronize in one system with cell phones or with text message, having a physical place where we can do a board where we can post our needs, you know, where through social distancing, we can still figure out how to post our needs, post what we have. It's a whole way that we can communicate, setting up phone trees, texting groups. There's so many ways that we can set up the communication. And I know that some people be like, well, I don't have the time to do a whole mutual aid network. It's so expensive. Just set up the texting. Just set up the group. Just set it up. Even the Facebook group, because once things are bigger needs, people are going to look for things. And we have to have some basic things set up for the people that you're trying to bring in, right? The second thing is create ways for people to share what they need and what they have. Because some people have stuff that they can give. You know, we have a lot of great creative people. We have a lot of teachers. We have a lot of people that can bring a lot of joy to other people. That have resources that can give to other people. And there are people that have a lot of needs. So, and everyone has a little bit of both, right? So how do we have a way? I know people have been doing spreadsheets. There's surveys. We can do paper surveys. There's a lot of things, but that's a constant question that the network needs to be asking itself. What is it need? What do people need? And what do you have? And the more that we can organize that, the better it will be for the network to find itself. Because the biggest hidden thing that the network is trying to figure out is that sometimes we don't know what people need and what they have. That's because most people, if, you know, even if we have deep relationships, if we haven't asked ourselves the question, we might not know. So it's important to create those things. These are just the basics. And then the last part of this is to do the outreach, to actively reach out to others, more and more people engage. Flyering. I think people should do flyering if possible. Of course, you know, being careful with your own, if you're comfortable doing that or not, putting flyers, putting little messages in people's doors if you're doing local stuff, you know, doing online groups, but also reaching out to people in ways, you know, getting the voter data from your local organizations or getting people's database so that we can call our block. That's what I've been trying to find, all the phone numbers of everyone on my block, you know, so that we can call them and be like, hey, text message, hey, I'm Carlos from this address, you know, hey, I want to make sure you're good, or, you know, start those networks that are going to be needed. Paul, do you want to talk about the number there?
So what a lot of what we're talking about is the emergence of a mutual aid movement that has a common meta story and a meta organization. And we think that's going to happen if people stop thinking just about them doing it at the local level or in a family level or within churches or within unions. And there's tons of great models out there right now, but there needs to be a unity that needs to emerge, and I think will emerge. But we want to encourage people into doing that, into really investing in communicating with other local mutual aid groups, learning from other groups, sharing what we learn, and getting best practices. It's a lot of times hard to do that in urgency, to really emphasize being connected to a larger movement when you originally formed just locally to meet needs. The second thing is that we need to start sharing between groups, and that is where a lot of times a collective identity and meta organization happens, is when we start sharing. Organization and movement can start emerging, but we're really encouraging people to emphasize that. Right now, there's a lot of really interesting examples of unions right now at the LA and Los Angeles. The County Federation of Labor is networking the union mutual aid network. Some of that is servicing, but there is some really innovative work, especially with the hotel and restaurant workers, Local 1, Local 11 in Los Angeles and in Chicago, that is doing vibrant stuff in engaging all their members in providing services, and then getting those people connected to a larger sense of a mutual aid movement. Doyle Canny is doing, she's a progressive, running for a seat of the House of Representatives in Eugene, Oregon. She's changing her electoral strategy to her whole infrastructure to do mass phone banking to try to do neighbor to neighborhood connections. All those are really interesting efforts that and then just the massive thousands, hundreds of groups locally that are bubbling up on Google Docs. But what we're encouraging is that those efforts are really important, but it's only going to become a movement if we start really interconnecting. And the great effort of Interoccupy, the national Slack channel that is connecting those people, is all starting the effort, the kindling of I believe, a new movement.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you, Paul. I just wanted to add something related to the second point on this, and I'm sure folks know that not all neighborhoods are created equally or are even the same or similar, and so just wanted to reiterate the fact that I think we'll find neighborhoods that have different barriers or different issues that they're dealing with. We're in East Boston, for example, and so what's been supportive for us is actually to do phone banking, to call people individually to see if there are any needs that arise, and coordinating the information ourselves, and that folks maybe aren't as much going to be filling out a form just because people have different access to internet or maybe different capacities in terms of filling out forms. And so maybe if folks have plentiful or abundance in terms of their resources, even volunteers who would be willing to do phone banking from one neighborhood to actually support another neighborhood, or to say, okay, this is missing there, how can we support there? That's, I feel, a part of the process as well of ensuring that there's more equity in terms of the support that we're really creating, and the mutual aid we're creating.
Thank you, Fati. And just to wrap this up before we give it back to Fatima, is that this is a very introductory workshop where we're trying to really get clear around, first, that we need to orient around mutual aid long term. I feel like it's not just going to happen for a couple of weeks. We really need to deeply understand this. I think we're definitely at a crossroads, of needs that we need to figure out how to meet, and needs that are going to become even more intense as the situation worsens, right? So really the big message of this webinar is that, and those are some of the basic things that we think are foundational to get the networks going. I know there is a survey that we've been filling out for other needs to really figure out so we can do further workshops and things like that. But I just wanted to pass it to Fatima so that she can bring us to the next part.
Thank you. So we just wanted to share, we have a resource list. We created a one-pager on resources related to mutual aid. There's a first section that's about what we've mentioned during this presentation already, but then we also have links to a lot of other databases, resource lists, articles, and websites with toolkits, maps, and mutual aid information. There's a lot of local mutual aid networks already. And there are many more that will be created. So we're hoping that this helps all of you. And we can also be updating with new information that we get. I just copied and pasted it into the chat, the link. There was one other thing I wanted to mention about it. Oh, I see people joining already. On there, you'll also see under point 4 for mutual aid resources, it says connect. There is a Slack. If you're already part of local mutual aid efforts, I'm seeing the questions coming in for folks that are, I can tell you're already working on mutual aid networks, that that is a Slack or a platform for people to connect who are doing mutual aid efforts, to have conversations, to support each other. And we've linked it on there as well. So that's it on the resource list. Next. As Carlos mentioned, we are doing a survey just to understand more what's important to cover in the future and what educational resources are needed related to the topic. So I just linked that there just for folks, if that's helpful, or that would be helpful for us if you could fill it out. Next. And we do have some upcoming webinars. So next Tuesday on March 31st, we're hosting Movement Ecology in Times of Crisis, because we're just seeing organizations advocate for particular solutions, workers striking for basic protections, leaders or institutional leaders working to redirect funding towards rapid response, and so many other efforts. So since we're being pulled in many directions, we feel it's important to understand how the responses actually relate to each other and distinguish what is supportive to creating an effective multi-strategic response. So again, that's next Tuesday. I have the link and I'm pasting it on there. And then the Tuesday after that, on April 7th, we're sharing important introductory frameworks on resources to help with building emotional resilience. So we know that alongside strategies of response, we need more emotional support. And there are traditions, practices, and resources that can help us strengthen our resilience. And so that webinar, we're hoping that will support folks in that, in building more awareness on what's going on and raise our capacity to really go through this transition together. I feel like it's been mentioned before, but this transition is gonna last months and months. Yeah, so I'll link it on there as well. And last but not least, I know we're heading towards 9 o'clock here on the East Coast. So for sure, folks that have to leave right away, feel free to do so. But there were some really great questions. I love these questions and I'm excited that I wanted to share. There was one that I think is good to clarify on here, which is, are you encouraging every organization to incorporate a mutual aid strategy or just some organizations? Carlos or Paul?
Yes. Yes, I mean, I would say that everyone needs to orient to how to support mutual aid. I think there's different roles that people can take in supporting mutual aid. I think the first agreement is, please don't talk bad about mutual aid. Some people might say like, what are you doing all that? Just focus on the advocacy. Some people might do that. So I think some people everyone has a role of just speaking positively about this. I've seen this happen in rates before, you know, like you can believe it has happened. And but I do think everyone has to orient to it. I think what kind of resources everyone can do in one positions, I think those are, each organization has to go through, but I think everyone should orient to mutual aid in this moment. I don't know, what do you think, Paul?
Well, a lot of this, we talk about movement ecology. People have different roles to play. You know, we say there's advocacy and there's mutual aid, but we think that really right now in this trigger event, because there's a huge gap in both millions of people being trapped at home, we have to understand that there's a missing piece that we all contribute to. How do we contribute to is very different. Unions, maybe they're doing their own mutual aid thing, or maybe they're supporting other people that are doing mutual aid in different ways, right? But mutual aid is one of the only things that can fill that gap, and we have to orient to that. And that's what this trigger event, that's what this whole webinar is a lot about, and we each need to figure out. One of the things we say in movement ecology is you don't have to do everything, you just have to be in relationship to everything, right? And that orienting to how you relate to mutual aid efforts and support them. Each person needs to support it at whatever level they can, even if it's just you know, communicating and getting the word out and the story out to other people so that they can rely on them.
Just to give an example in how we orient to mutual aid, and that's different sometimes from advocacy and how they relate, is that I know everyone right now is dealing with the rent. How do I pay rent, right? And I know that some people, the service perspective is like, how do we figure out finding money so you can pay rent? Does that make some sense? The advocacy perspective is, how do we get a rent freeze to happen, right? Those are all great responses. We need those to happen. But a mutual aid response is actually, a lot of people are afraid of calling their landlord because they feel threatened by the landlord. So if we do mutual aid calls about, hey, we just need to get in the calls to see how can we talk to our landlord? How can we prepare to talk to our landlord? We want to also find out if our landlord has other people that they rent to, you know? So there's so much mutual aid that we need to do even to do the rent. Now, once you discover all these renters that are in your block, in the neighborhood, and you have 10,000 renters together in a chat or in a list, then it's actually easier to move them to do a rent strike. You have the masses already, but sometimes it starts with some of the mutual aid pieces, you know?
I also think that everyone needs to orient to calling more people, to breaking social isolation. And really, that is the first step to mutual aid. And even if we're not in a more elaborate national movement or a network, just building mutual aid into our lives is something that I encourage all of us to be doing, even if it's at the family level or in the community.
Thank you both. There's another question that I think is a bit of a teaser actually to the next webinar, but this is from Kazu. In your perspective, is mutual aid and how you define alternatives in the movement ecology interchangeable?
Okay. Well, no, alternatives is a wide variety of different things. Cooperatives, for instance, a lot of cooperatives like the Madrigons are actually functioning as an alternative to the market, okay? And some of them are alternative services, not mutual aid. But services do fit into the alternatives, but not all alternatives have a mutual aid strategy and philosophy, okay? So, and even the concept of reciprocity is a philosophy of exchange that covers more than just what we are defining as mutual aid. It covers lots of different things, but mutual aid is a specific form of reciprocity and alternatives.
Thank you for the response, Paul. Another question, can mutual aid actually replace these failing systems, or is it just a survival technique?
That is such a good question. And I think it's such a larger question about the kind of society we need to build, the kind of alternative we need to build, that the alternative then has to become the dominant, right? I think that is a large question. I think there is a humongous possibility. You know, I think there is a humongous possibility from the moment, the trigger event moment, this huge moment that is going to keep happening for a while, and it's going to have ups and downs, but it's still in a lot of heightened. There's a lot of opportunity to really consciously build new consensus of consciousness about what kind of system we need. And I actually think the mutual aid efforts could be extremely helpful. For example, I can see a mutual aid network of renters be very effective at actually transitioning to have cooperative housing and actually taking, like, for example, I guess it should be public already from my neighborhood. There's a lot of development. There's a lot of empty condos in my neighborhood and a lot of people that don't have places to live. I think it could create a capacity to take over those buildings and transform them into something that it could be more useful. So I think there's humongous amounts of possibility. I mean, again, for us, it's not just survival. We want to figure out how to thrive as a society well, but it's a question of vision. It's a question of leadership. And it's also a question of strategy. I think a lot of us don't have the strategic vision sometimes because we're trying just to figure out one need, you know, but we actually have to be, hold on, what we're building could help in this other area, or we can transform our lives in another way. And to be honest with you, for me, one of the greatest reliefs, to be honest with you, about the system is that I feel like I've been crazy with a lot of my peers for a long time, because in my family, or, you know, not all over my family, but some members of my family or my friends, they don't recognize that we're being in a wrong time. And I think now it's bringing us in alignment, you know, and I think people are seeing that we don't have a social welfare system that is strong. That's not important to people. So I think it creates a humongous opening for a lot of different alternatives. And in our next session of movement ecology that we're doing next Tuesday, we're going to talk about it's like a more complex understanding of the strategic parts, you know, so that you can see kind of how all it moves. But we wanted to first cover mutual aid because it's also so important and also sometimes so not talked about in this context.
Thank you, Carlos. Again, thank you to those who have been with us so far. We're actually going to continue asking some questions to Paul and Carlos. So if you can stick around, please feel free to do so. And if you can't, you can also go ahead and leave. We'll be emailing the video to everyone that signed up and registered for the webinar. That last question, by the way, was from Kenza. Thank you so much for the question. This next question is from Yolanda. Is there such a thing as too many mutual aid networks? I have a network with my immediate neighbors, another with a group of folks in my city, another with my family, et cetera, but it's hard to keep up and or contribute to too many networks at the same time.
A lot of these strategic questions are very contextual. And so they're hard to respond to. I mean, I think when there is a huge gap, let 1,000 flowers bloom, because you never have enough support. There's not enough mutual aid to go around. So forming more and in different contexts is what we need. In time, I believe that the trigger event will create the space for a movement to arise. And at that point, it's very important for there to be coordination, and having a lot of groups can create tensions and conflicts and a lot of things. I project that that's going to be a problem. Right now, I think the biggest problem that I'm hearing from you is more yourself, is the problem it creates for yourself, not necessarily the community, which I relate to. I'm involved in too many things and it's competing, you know, for my time of where I put my energy. And I respect that. I think that is a real legitimate problem. But for the community, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom right now in the vacuum. That's my opinion. And then hopefully in time, there will be meta organizations, and there will be organizations that it doesn't make sense to replicate certain efforts. But right now, there's so much need that there's very little replication.
Thank you. Yeah, I would add something similar, which is I feel the more the merrier, so that more folks' needs can be met and more people can actually be contributing. I think the hope, right, is that eventually some of the networks will also be kind of observed or to absorbed or to be bridged with other networks, so that you can actually opt into particular ones instead of having to be in so many. And I think also part of it is related to how we identify a lot of the times. Maybe we want to be connected to folks in this way because we identify in a particular manner. And so I think that's part of it as well. But thank you. Let me go to the list. Let's see. I'm seeing some organizing communities that aren't already connected. And and really how the ways to build relationship in a short amount of time, in particular in this folks can't meet each other physically, I'll be virtual. I don't know if either of you have any suggestions or thoughts on that.
I think the phone is friends, I think for neighborhood mind where people are not online or people are not as online as connected. I think getting the people's list. I think asking your local organization, hey, send me the list and I'll phone bank. I think there's magic we can do on the phones. You know, it feels so weird because now we don't even do phones; we just do text. You know? But I think we can do a combination of it, of texting people and finding a time where we can connect with people. You know, but I think really calling, and I think really going old school and building the list. We just have to build the list and call people up to try to connect with people. You know, I also think there's a lot of manifestations of solidarity that could happen. For example, people asking people to put. I think somebody was doing. For people to put colors in their door for what kind of needs people have. People could also put messages on their window, you know. I think there's something nice about also showing the solidarity in one way or the other so that people hear, like at 8 p.m., everyone get your pants and pots and let's scream for the healthcare workers that are helping us, you know. So like, I think there's a lot of tactics that we can use to get people's attentions. And I think we just have to call people in this time and really find out their numbers. I think through the voter data, we can do a lot of that, you know? I think your local organization that does civic engagement, hey, I need a list cut from 50 Liverpool to 150 Liverpool Street. Can you send me all the names that you have, you know? Let me call them all and let me find who are the leaders in this community. Who are the people that from my phone banking seem the most interested? Maybe I find 3, I find 4, I find 5. Then I can get them on a call all together and we can do a little group. And we can say, hey, we're all neighbors on this stuff. And as the people that you selected through your calls that they're the most excited about helping out, let's form a committee with them. And they become the captains of the network. You know, they become the one that are really taking care of the networks. They become network captains, network facilitators. They're there to support, and they're the ones that have a little bit of relationships everywhere. So that would be my recommendation. I don't know if you'll have other ones as well. I know there's 100 ways to do this stuff.
I just want to say that there's incredible guides out there. You know, Somerville, Medford. That's not in. I'm not in Boston, so I don't even know how to pronounce it. But I've been looking over a lot of the Google spreadsheets of lots of different organizations, and certain neighborhoods are really much more advanced in developing a hotline and flyering and creating community. Somerville, Medford, for some reason, is really great, is much more organized than a lot of other neighborhoods. And they actually, I think, put out a guide for how to make a neighborhood one. There's multiple guides out there about how and they recommend certain things. We're just giving some of our opinions about our past experience with mutual aid, but I really recommend going to the resources when it comes to really technical questions, right? Like where do we start? What technology to use? What is the first thing should we phone bank or leaflet, and creating a hotline? I think hotlines have been working really well. I know from talking to different people in mutual aid networks that have already formed, as hotlines are very helpful, and flyering has been very helpful.
Thank you both. I feel like we've answered. That was a very good reminder, Paul. Some of the other questions are very specific. For sure, just want to keep recommending either the Slack or the conversations that are also happening between folks that are already doing mutual aid, in particular in the context or the regions that you might be in, because that's where you'll get some more fine-tuned responses or information. The more we're communicating, the more we can learn from each other and also share solutions to the barriers that we've already been facing. So I think I'll leave it at that with the questions. I know we didn't answer everything, and there are more questions in the survey, but this is all very helpful for us to just continue to build the resource list that we have or direct folks to other lists. Like Paul mentioned, there is a lot out there. I'll be grateful for when that one website gets created where you can find everything. But thank you so much to everyone that was with us tonight. Yeah, thanks for joining.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great night.